April 1241, Western Poland. The greatest fighting force the world had ever seen was about to crash into the best knights of Europe. What happened over the next 3 days would destroy the belief that Europeans could not be beaten and leave a mark on the shared memory of Christian lands that would last for hundreds of years. The Mongols had come. To understand how huge this disaster was, we must first understand who these Mongols were. They were not the wild, out-of-control group that European writers would later describe. They were the followers of Genghis Khan's amazing new military system, a force that had taken over lands from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe in just 2 generations. Every Mongol warrior could ride a horse before he could walk properly. He could shoot a bow with deadly aim while riding at full speed. He could survive on mare's milk and dried meat for weeks, traveling distances that European armies thought were impossible. By 1241, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to the gates of Europe. The great cities of Central Asia had fallen. The Islamic world's most powerful kingdoms had been destroyed. The supposedly unbreakable Great Wall of China had proven useless. Now under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, 3 Tumans, 30,000 of the most well-trained warriors on earth, had already destroyed Kiev, the jewel of the Russian lands, and torn through Hungary like a tornado through wheat. The Mongol invasion of Europe was not random violence. It was a carefully planned campaign of conquest. Batu Khan had divided his forces. One army destroyed Hungary. Another moved through Poland, carefully destroying any force that could threaten the Mongol sides. They had already burned Lublin, attacked Sandomir, and left Krakow a smoking ruin. Now they turned towards Silesia, one of Poland's richest regions. Duke Henry II of Silesia, called Henry the Pious because of his love for the church, knew what was coming. He was no fool. Desperate messages had arrived from the east, each more scary than the last. Entire cities turned to ashes in single days. Populations killed down to the last child. Armies that had stood for hundreds of years destroyed in hours. The messages spoke of devils on horseback who fought with supernatural teamwork, who appeared from nowhere and disappeared like smoke. But Henry was no coward. He was an experienced commander who had fought in many campaigns. More importantly, he understood that if the Mongols were not stopped here, all of Europe lay open before them. He sent urgent messages across Poland, Moravia, and the German states. The response was huge. The Knights Templar, those legendary warrior monks who had fought in the Crusades, answered the call. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from their campaigns in the Baltic, marched south with their heavy cavalry. Polish nobility from across the broken-up kingdom put aside their fights and gathered their troops. Duke Mieszko of Opole brought his entire force. Moravian infantry marched north. Even gold miners from the rich Silesian mines, men who had never held a sword, volunteered to defend Christendom. Written records by terrified monks claimed 100,000 men stood ready to face the Mongol threat. This was almost certainly an exaggeration born of fear and hope. Modern historians studying the supplies and population records suggest the real number was closer to 25,000 or 40,000, but even that smaller number represented one of the largest European armies of the medieval period. To put this in perspective, William the Conqueror had conquered England with perhaps 10,000 men. The largest armies of the Third Crusade barely went over 30,000. Against them stood perhaps 20,000 Mongols, 2 Tumans under the command of Baidar and Kadan. The Europeans had more soldiers. They had heavier armor, the finest metalworking in the world at that time. They had the blessing of the Pope. They had God on their side, or so they believed. They would need all of it, and it would not be enough. The Mongol commanders, Baidar and Kadan, were not the wild people of European imagination, but military geniuses trained in the art of war since childhood. Baidar was a grandson of Genghis Khan, raised in the tradition of the great conqueror. Kadan was the son of Ogadei Khan, the great Khan himself. These were not just raiders, but strategic thinkers who had studied European tactics for years through their spy network. Yes, the Mongols had spies throughout Europe, often disguised as merchants. They knew exactly how European armies fought. The mounted knight was the tank of medieval warfare. Hundreds of pounds of man, armor, and horse combined into a devastating charge that could break any infantry line. But the Mongols also knew the weaknesses. Knights were slow. Their horses got tired quickly under the weight. They fought for personal glory, often breaking formation to chase individual combat. Most importantly, European armies depended on close combat, while Mongol thinking emphasized killing the enemy before he could reach you. Day 1, April 7th, 1241. The European army moved forward from Legnica in traditional formation, a sight that would have stirred any medieval heart. In the center rode the heavy cavalry, knights in chain mail and early plate armor, their helmets shining, lances held high. Each knight's armor alone cost as much as a village might produce in a year. Their war horses, massive destriers bred for strength rather than speed, snorted and stamped, eager for battle. On the sides marched the infantry, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, Silesian miners with homemade weapons. They sang hymns as they marched, their voices carrying across the plains. Priests moved through the ranks, blessing weapons and offering forgiveness. Banners flew, the Black Cross of the Teutonic Order, the Red Cross of the Templars, the White Eagle of Poland. It was a magnificent sight, the combined military might of Eastern European Christendom. Then on the horizon dust, not the dust of another army marching, but something different, lighter, faster, wrong somehow. The first Mongol riders appeared like ghosts, light cavalry on small, ugly horses that looked like ponies compared to the European war horses. The knights laughed. These were the terrifying Mongols? These small men on their small horses? They looked like they could be ridden down in a single charge. The Mongol riders came within arrow range, but not European arrow range. Mongol composite bows made from horn, sinew, and wood could accurately strike at 350 meters, far beyond the range of European crossbows. The riders fired, their arrows flying high into the sky, then turned their horses and retreated. "Cowards!" the Polish knights shouted. "They run like rabbits, like women." But running was exactly what the Mongols wanted. This was not cowardice, but calculated battle plan. For hours, wave after wave of horse archers attacked the European lines. They would ride in, fire, and retreat before the heavy cavalry could respond. Each Mongol carried 60 arrows in their quivers, with supply horses carrying hundreds more. 20,000 men times 60 arrows equals 1.2 million arrows. The math of death. The Europeans raised their shields and endured, but the mental effect was terrible. Knights were trained for glorious charges, for the clash of steel on steel, for honorable single combat. Instead, they stood like targets while enemies they couldn't reach slowly hurt them. Horses screamed as arrows found gaps in their armor. Men cursed as shafts went through mail at the joints. The infantry with less armor suffered even more. Duke Henry ordered his crossbowmen to respond, but it was useless. By the time they had cranked their crossbows for a shot, the Mongols were out of range. The Templars asked permission to charge. Henry refused. He knew that's what the Mongols wanted, to draw his forces out bit by bit and destroy them. But holding formation while being slowly shot to pieces was destroying morale. As the sun began to set on that first day, the true horror of Mongol warfare became clear. This would not be a glorious battle, but a grinding slaughter. By nightfall, hundreds of Europeans were dead or wounded. Men with arrows in their shoulders, legs, faces. Horses had to be put down. The screaming of the wounded filled the camp. The Mongols had lost perhaps a dozen men, mostly from lucky crossbow shots. They made camp just out of sight, their signal fires twinkling like stars fallen to earth. All night, Mongol drummers beat their war drums, keeping the Europeans awake, wearing down their nerves. Day 2, April 8th, 1241. Dawn came blood red, a sign that even the priests struggled to explain away. The European army, exhausted from a sleepless night, formed ranks again. Many wounded men had died during the night, and morale was breaking. Arguments broke out between the Polish nobles and the Templar commanders about tactics. The Teutonic Knights demanded an immediate charge. Duke Mieszko of Opole threatened to take back his forces if they continued to stand and be slaughtered like cattle. Henry knew he had to act. When Mongol riders appeared again at dawn using the same attacking tactics, he made a fateful decision. He ordered Duke Mieszko to lead a partial cavalry charge. Not the entire force, but enough to drive off the horse archers and perhaps capture some for questioning. 2,000 of Poland's finest knights thundered forward. The ground shook under the weight of their charge. Lances lowered, shields raised. They were an avalanche of steel and flesh. The Mongol light cavalry, seemingly panicked by this display of force, turned and fled. The Europeans chased, their blood up, hungry for revenge after yesterday's embarrassment. "We have them!" Mieszko shouted. "Press forward. Glory to Christ! Kill them all!" The pursuit stretched for miles. The European horses carrying armored men began to tire, but the Mongols always seemed just out of reach, occasionally turning to fire a few arrows, pushing the knights to greater effort. Some Polish nobles began to suspect a trap, but Mieszko, consumed with battle fury, pushed onward. It was exactly what the Mongols had been waiting for. The fake retreat, the Mongols' signature tactic perfected over decades of warfare. As the Polish cavalry became spread out over miles of pursuit, their formation completely broken, the trap snapped shut with terrifying precision. Mongol heavy cavalry, yes, the Mongols had heavy cavalry too, something the Europeans hadn't expected, came out from hidden positions in the rolling land. Light cavalry units that had been circling unseen now closed in from all sides. Duke Mieszko realized his deadly error, but it was too late. His force was surrounded, cut off from the main army, isolated on the open steppe where European knights had no advantage. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic execution. The Mongols didn't fight in heroic close combat. They circled the trapped Europeans like wolves around sheep, pouring arrows into the mass of men and horses. When knights tried to break out, they were driven back by coordinated charges. When they stood still, they were shot to pieces. The Mongol heavy cavalry, when they did charge, did so only when the enemy was already weakened and disorganized. Duke Mieszko himself fought bravely. Accounts say he personally killed a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows brought him down. His bodyguards made a last stand around his fallen body, singing death songs, but they were overwhelmed. Of the 2,000 knights who had charged that morning, fewer than 200 made it back to Henry's camp. The survivors were traumatized, some driven mad by what they had witnessed. They spoke of demons who fought with supernatural coordination, who seemed to communicate without words, who killed without mercy or honor. One knight, his armor pierced by 7 arrows, died, repeating, "They are not men. They are not men." That night the Mongols sent a message to Henry's camp. It was Duke Mieszko's head preserved in salt with a simple note in broken Latin. "Tomorrow you." Day 3. April 9th, 1241, the day of destruction. Henry's war council that morning was a scene of barely controlled panic. He had lost nearly a quarter of his army. The Moravian infantry were on the edge of desertion. Several Polish nobles had already fled during the night with their troops. But Henry knew that retreat was impossible. The Mongols would run them down on the open plains. The only choice was to stand and fight, to make one last desperate battle. Henry chose his ground carefully. A field near the village of Legnica Field. It had a slight rise that would give his archers an advantage, and a stream on one side that would prevent being surrounded. He arranged his forces in a defensive formation. The Templars and Teutonic Knights formed the center. These religious warriors would not flee. Polish knights took the right wing, the remaining infantry the left. Henry himself commanded the reserve. As the morning mist cleared, the Mongols appeared. But something was different. They weren't moving in their usual flowing formations. Instead, they seemed to be setting up strange devices, large pots or cauldrons mounted on wheels. The Europeans watched, puzzled. Were these some kind of cooking pots? Were the pagans performing some ritual? Then the battle began, and the true horror of Mongol innovation was revealed. The devices were Chinese gunpowder weapons, not cannons. Those were still decades away, but smoke makers. The Mongols had learned this technology during their conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. As the European army advanced, the Mongols lit these devices, creating massive clouds of thick, choking smoke that rolled across the battlefield. Within minutes, the carefully organized European formation began to fall apart. Men couldn't see more than a few feet. Commands couldn't be heard over the coughing and confusion. Units lost contact with each other. Banners, the medieval command and control system, disappeared in the smoke. Knights stumbled into their own infantry. Horses, panicked by the smoke, became uncontrollable. Then came the psychological masterstroke. Days earlier, the Mongols had captured Polish prisoners and forced them to learn one phrase in Polish. Uciekajcie, straceni jesteśmy, run, all is lost. Now, in the smoke and confusion, Mongol warriors who had learned these words shouted them across the battlefield. Polish soldiers, unable to see through the smoke, hearing what sounded like Polish voices, believed their own commanders were ordering retreat. Panic spread like plague. Men began to run, colliding with others trying to hold formation. The infantry on the left wing broke first, streaming away from the battlefield. This left the center where the Templars and Teutonic Knights stood firm, but they were now isolated islands in a sea of chaos. The Mongols attacked with perfect coordination. How they kept unit teamwork in the smoke remains a mystery. Perhaps they used drums or horns at sounds that cut through the chaos, or perhaps they had simply practiced this tactic so many times that each unit knew its role by heart. Light cavalry struck from the sides, pouring arrows into the confused mass. Heavy cavalry smashed into broken units, shattering them completely. The Knights Templar fought with the courage of men who believed they were earning martyrdom. Surrounded, outnumbered, unable to see their enemies until they were almost upon them, they stood in a circle and fought to the last man. Their Grand Master, Popo von Osterna, was found after the battle with 23 arrows in his body, his sword broken, surrounded by Mongol dead. The Teutonic Knights attempted to cut their way out, forming a wedge and charging blindly through the smoke. They actually broke through the Mongol lines only to find themselves in open country with Mongol cavalry in pursuit. They were run down one by one, their heavy armor becoming a death trap as their exhausted horses collapsed. Duke Henry, seeing his army falling apart, made the fatal decision to try to rally his forces. He rode forward with his personal banner, trying to create a rallying point. For a moment it seemed to work. Polish knights began to gather at his position. Then a Mongol arrow fired by an unknown archer struck him in the armpit where his armor plates joined. He swayed in his saddle but stayed mounted, trying to continue fighting. His bodyguards closed around him, attempting to get him off the battlefield, but the Mongols had marked him as the commander. They put their entire force on this small group. Henry's guards died one by one. Finally, Henry himself, weakened by blood loss, fell from his horse. Seeing their duke fall, the last organized resistance collapsed. It became a retreat, then a slaughter. The Mongols chased the fleeing Europeans for miles, cutting them down as they ran. Armored knights threw away their armor to run faster. Proud nobles begged for mercy in languages the Mongols didn't understand or chose not to understand. Duke Henry, still alive but dying, was captured. The Mongol commanders, following the tradition of honoring brave enemies, offered him a quick death. He refused, saying he would die as he had lived, as a Christian knight. The Mongols obliged. His head was cut off and placed on a spear, later paraded around the city of Legnica as proof of victory. His mother, searching the battlefield days later, could only identify his body by his polydactyly. He had been born with 6 toes on his left foot. By noon on April 9th, it was over. The size of the disaster was almost impossible to understand. The Mongols, following their custom, cut off the right ear of each killed enemy to count the dead. They filled 9 large leather sacks. Written accounts claim between 10,000 and 25,000 European dead. Nearly the entire nobility of Silesia had been eliminated. The Templars and Teutonic Knights had lost so many brothers that it would take a generation to rebuild their numbers. Entire family lines that had ruled for centuries were wiped out in a single morning. The Mongol casualties, modern historians estimate less than 700 men, and many of those were from the heavy cavalry used in the final charges. The battlefield itself was a vision of hell. Bodies lay so thick that in places you could walk for hundreds of yards without touching the ground. Carrion birds circled in clouds so thick they blocked the sun. The stench could be smelled for miles. Local peasants would find bones in their fields for decades afterward. In just 3 days, a smaller Mongol force had completely destroyed one of the largest European armies ever put together. But the Battle of Legnica was more than just a military defeat. It was a mental disaster that shattered European confidence and changed the course of history. News of the disaster spread across Europe like wildfire. In Paris, King Louis IX immediately began strengthening the city's walls and training his army in new tactics. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to defend Europe itself from these devils on horseback. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, locked in his own conflict with the Pope, suddenly found both sides willing to discuss peace in the face of this outside threat. Letters from this period reveal the depth of European terror. One German writer wrote, The Mongols are the punishment of God for our sins. They fight not as men fight, with honor and courage, but as demons fight, with cunning and cruelty. Our knights, the finest warriors in Christendom, were as children before them. The mental impact went beyond military concerns. The Mongols had shown that the entire basis of European feudal military power, the mounted knight, was outdated against a disciplined, tactically superior force. The detailed codes of chivalry, the individual heroism, the honor-based combat that defined European warfare meant nothing against an enemy who fought to win by any means necessary. Luckily for Europe, salvation came from an unexpected source. In December 1241, 8 months after Legnica, the great Khan Ogedei died in Mongolia. He had been drinking heavily. Some sources suggest he was poisoned and died suddenly during a hunting trip. By Mongol law, all members of the royal family had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan, frustrated but obedient to tradition, pulled back his armies from Europe. The Mongols would never go this far into Europe again. Political struggles in Mongolia, the vast distances involved, and the eventual breaking up of the Mongol Empire meant that the threat gradually went away. But the lesson had been burned into European memory with fire and blood. The Battle of Legnica forced a revolution in European military thinking. Within a generation, European armies began adopting combined arms tactics, improving their archery, and developing early gunpowder weapons. The age of the mounted knight's absolute supremacy on the battlefield was beginning its long, slow end. Professional armies would gradually replace feudal armies. Tactics and discipline would become more important than individual bravery. Some historians argue that Legnica saved Europe by teaching it harsh lessons just in time. When the Ottoman Turks, followers of many Mongol military traditions, threatened Europe 2 centuries later, European armies were ready with combined arms, gunpowder weapons, and professional discipline. The Europe that faced the Ottomans was not the Europe that had faced the Mongols. The Mongols had taught Europe a lesson written in blood. Adapt or die, evolution through disaster. And they had taught it in just 3 days. Today, the Battle of Legnica is remembered differently by different nations. In Poland, it's a national tragedy, but also a source of pride. Their ancestors stood against impossible odds to defend Europe. In Mongolia, it's celebrated as one of the greatest tactical victories in military history. In military academies worldwide, it's studied as a perfect example of how superior tactics and discipline can overcome more soldiers and technological advantages. The battlefield itself is now peaceful farmland. A small monument stands where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Every year on April 9th, historical reenactors gather to honor the battle. They wear accurate armor, carry replica weapons, and try to recreate the tactics of both sides. But no reenactment can capture the terror of that smoke-filled morning when the medieval world order died on the plains of Silesia. The echo of those Mongol horses' hoofbeats still sounds through history. They remind us that no empire, no matter how powerful, no system, no matter how established, is safe from sudden disastrous change. The Mongols didn't just defeat an army at Legnica. They shattered a worldview, ended an era, and forced an entire civilization to change or die, all in just 3 days. 3 days that changed the world forever.